You wake to perfumed darkness, rose petals beneath your silk-wrapped body, gold bangles heavy on your wrists, pressed against cool marble floor. The scent of jasmine and musk hangs thick in the air, mixing with something sharper, opium smoke from the outer chambers. You're in the zenana of the Mughal palace, somewhere deep within walls that no man except the emperor may cross. Somewhere between captivity and queenship. Somewhere women disappeared into and never truly left, even if their bodies walked free decades later. You hear footsteps, eunuch guards passing in corridors lined with latticed screens. Through the carved stone jali, you glimpse the forbidden world beyond. Gardens you'll never walk alone, streets you'll never see again. A sky that belongs to everyone except you. This is the gilded cage of the Mughal harem, and you're about to discover that being chosen by an emperor wasn't elevation. It was erasure. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. Picture Delhi, 1556. Akbar the Great is consolidating his empire, building an administration that will last centuries. But while historians celebrate his religious tolerance and administrative genius, they whisper less about what happened behind the zenana walls, where thousands of women existed in a hierarchy more complex and more brutal than most medieval courts. The Mughal harem wasn't a monolithic entity. It was a carefully stratified system, a kingdom within a kingdom with its own economy, politics, and violence. At the top stood the empress consorts, women who had borne the emperor's sons or came from powerful families whose alliances mattered. Then came the begums, wives of slightly lesser status. Below them, the concubines who had caught the emperor's eye but hadn't yet borne children or never would. And at the bottom, the slave women, thousands of them. Women captured in war, purchased in markets, gifted as tribute from vassal states. Women whose names no one bothered to record because they were considered property, not people. The numbers themselves are staggering. Contemporary accounts from Portuguese Jesuit priest Antonio Monserrate, who visited Akbar's court in 1580, describe harems of over 5,000 women. Not all were concubines. Many were servants, entertainers, guards, administrators. But the core remained the same. Women brought against their will, kept against their will, their bodies considered assets of the empire itself. The selection process was systematic. After military campaigns in Rajasthan, Gujarat, Bengal, the Deccan, Mughal officers conducted what the Persian chronicles euphemistically called woman censuses. They categorized captured women by age, beauty, apparent health, and social class. The most beautiful were marked for the imperial harem. Others went to officers and nobles according to rank. The rest were sold in slave markets throughout the empire. For the women marked for the harem, the journey began with erasure. Their names were changed to Persian or Turkic names deemed more appropriate for the court. A Hindu woman named Radha became Gulbadan, rose body. A Bengali girl called Lakshmi became Anarkali, pomegranate blossom. The new names severed ties to their past, marking them as possessions of the Mughal state. They were bathed, perfumed, dressed in silk so sheer it revealed more than it concealed, and transported in covered palanquins to the zenana quarters of whatever palace complex the emperor currently occupied. Agra, Fatehpur Sikri, Lahore. The location changed, but the system remained constant. Inside the zanana, they entered a world governed by rules as strict as any military code. Total segregation from the outside world. No letters could be sent without censorship. No visitors allowed except by imperial permission. Movement was controlled by female guards called urdubigis, warrior women often of Central Asian origin, who carried weapons and enforced zanana discipline with calculated brutality. The punishment system was elaborate. Minor infractions, speaking out of turn, showing insufficient deference, failing to perfect courtly etiquette, these earned public humiliation or temporary isolation. Serious offenses brought flogging administered by senior concubines, who had learned that survival sometimes meant becoming an instrument of the system that oppressed them. The worst punishment was expulsion from the harem, which sounds like freedom, but meant abandonment without resources, family, or protection in a society that viewed disgraced harem women as polluted and worthless. Most chose to endure rather than face that fate. But the physical punishments were almost merciful compared to the psychological architecture of control. The harem operated on manufactured scarcity and competition. The emperor's attention was the currency. Women who received imperial visits gained status, gifts, influence. Women ignored for months or years became invisible, their existence reduced to serving those who had found favor. This created a perpetual state of anxiety and rivalry. Friendships were dangerous because today's ally might become tomorrow's competitor for the emperor's bed. Trust was a liability. Isolation became survival strategy. The waiting itself was torture. A woman might spend decades in the harem without ever seeing the emperor privately. Babur's harem contained women he inherited from his father and grandfather, women who had spent 40 or 50 years waiting for attention that never came. Growing old in rooms filled with younger women, their youth and hope slowly fossilized into bitterness and despair. When the summons finally came, when eunuchs arrived to escort a woman to the emperor's chambers, the protocols were elaborate and dehumanizing. She would be bathed again, examined by female physicians to ensure she carried no disease, dressed according to the emperor's preferences, and instructed in the specific behaviors expected. Different emperors had different tastes. Akbar reportedly preferred animated conversation before intimacy. Jahangir wanted opium-enhanced compliance. Shah Jahan demanded elaborate seduction performances. The women were trained to provide whatever was required, their own desires utterly irrelevant. The encounter itself could last minutes or hours. Afterward, the woman would be returned to the zanana to wait. If she became pregnant, her status elevated immediately. Pregnancy meant relevance, meant a stake in succession politics, meant survival insurance. But pregnancy also brought danger. Rival factions within the harem saw pregnant women as threats. Poisonings were common. Miscarriages under suspicious circumstances happened with disturbing regularity. The Mughal chronicles record dozens of cases investigated by imperial physicians, though conclusions were always diplomatically vague. No one wanted to acknowledge that the harem was a battlefield where unborn children were casualties. For women who gave birth, the child's gender determined everything. A son meant security, influence, political relevance. The mother of a prince became a power player, her apartments filled with petitioners seeking her influence with the emperor. Nur Jahan, originally a concubine, leveraged her intelligence and her daughter's marriage to Prince Khurram to become the de facto ruler of the empire during Jahangir's opium-addled final years. But Nur Jahan was an exception so rare, she proves the rule. For every woman who gained power, thousands remained invisible. A daughter brought status, but less security. Girls were valuable as marriage alliances, but didn't carry the succession weight of sons. And children of either gender could be taken from their mothers and raised by senior wives or the emperor's female relatives. severing the one genuine emotional connection most harem women ever formed. Many mothers never fully recovered from having their infants removed, their milk drying up while they heard their babies crying in distant apartments they couldn't enter. The slave women at the bottom of the harem hierarchy faced the worst conditions. They weren't candidates for the emperor's attention unless he specifically requested novelty. They served the needs of higher-ranking women, dressing them, feeding them, entertaining them. And they were available for sexual use by the emperor without ceremony or preparation. A slave woman could be summoned, used, and returned to her duties within an hour, her experience unrecorded and unremembered. If she became pregnant, the child was usually taken at birth and either killed if obviously the emperor's features weren't apparent, or raised as a slave if useful traits appeared. Contemporary European travelers recorded their shock at the system. François Bernier, a French physician who spent years at Aurangzeb's court in the 1660s, wrote extensive accounts of harem conditions. He described women who hadn't seen sunlight in years, whose skin had become translucent from perpetual indoor confinement. He documented endemic depression, what he called diseases of melancholy, women who stopped eating, stopped speaking, simply waited to die. Mughal physicians treated these conditions with opium and herbal sedatives, not to cure, but to make the women functional enough to perform their duties. The medical texts preserved in the Mughal archives reveal systematic approaches to managing harem women's health. There are extensive protocols for preventing and treating sexually transmitted infections, evidence that such diseases were common enough to require standardized responses. There are detailed instructions for inducing abortions using herbal preparations and physical manipulations, suggesting that unwanted pregnancies from imperial encounters happened frequently enough to need medical management. And there are disturbing references to surgical procedures for repairing damage from violent sexual encounters, describing techniques for stitching torn tissue and treating internal injuries. The zanana also had its own economy, surprisingly complex for an enclosed world. Women received stipends based on their rank, paid in gold mohurs. Senior wives received substantial sums, enough to maintain their own households within the harem. To purchase luxuries from merchants allowed limited access to zanana markets, and to patronize artists, poets, and musicians. Lower-ranking women received minimal stipends, barely enough for basic comforts. Slave women received nothing. They survived on charity from higher-ranking women, or traded sexual favors with male servants and guards in exchange for small gifts and privileges. A dangerous transaction that could bring severe punishment if discovered. The harem maintained workshops where women produced textiles, embroidery, perfumes, and artwork. Some women found purpose in these crafts, developing genuine skill. The Mughal embroideries produced in imperial zananas were famous throughout the Islamic world. Intricate works requiring thousands of hours of labor, created by women whose names were never attached to their masterpieces. The work was unpaid labor, the products considered property of the imperial household. But for many women, the hours spent in focused craftwork provided psychological escape from the perpetual anxiety of harem existence. Escape was theoretically impossible. The zanana was guarded by eunuchs who had their own hierarchical structure and their own reasons to maintain the system. Senior eunuchs wielded enormous power, controlling access to the emperor, managing harem finances, and arbitrating disputes. They were often freed slaves who had been castrated as boys and raised in palace service. Their castration created a permanent separation from the world of men and women both. They existed in a third category, neither gender able to return to normal society. Many became extraordinarily cruel, perhaps projecting their own mutilation onto the women they controlled. The Urdu Begis, female guards, were recruited from Central Asian warrior cultures, where women sometimes fought alongside men. They were often slaves themselves, captured from defeated enemies, and offered a choice between regular slavery and harem guard service. They chose the latter and were trained in combat, given weapons, and granted authority over other women. It was a devil's bargain. They gained power by enforcing the system that enslaved them, and they exercised that power with zeal that suggested they needed to prove their loyalty constantly. Escape attempts happened anyway. The Mughal chronicles record dozens of cases, always ending badly. Women who tried to flee and were caught faced exemplary punishment designed to terrorize others into compliance. The most common method was public flogging, followed by months of solitary confinement in underground cells without light, food provided irregularly, no human contact except guards who pushed provisions through a slot. Women who survived this treatment were often permanently psychologically damaged, vacant-eyed and silent, but they were kept alive as warnings. A few women succeeded in escaping, usually with help from corrupt guards or sympathetic servants. But success meant living as fugitives in a society that offered no place for disgraced harem women. They couldn't return to their families, who were often dead or wouldn't accept the shame. They couldn't marry, as their status as imperial property made any relationship illegal. Most ended up as prostitutes or beggars, their freedom a different form of imprisonment. Some women chose suicide. The methods were varied and creative, as the harem was carefully designed to prevent self-harm. Women hoarded sleeping medications until they had lethal doses. They strangled themselves with their own hair, braided into ropes, and attached to ceiling fixtures during brief moments of privacy. They threw themselves from balconies during rare outdoor excursions. They stopped eating gradually enough that it looked like illness rather than intention. The Mughal records mention these deaths obliquely, as unfortunate losses rather than desperate acts of agency. When an emperor died, the harem faced catastrophic uncertainty. The new emperor inherited his father's zanana, but he rarely wanted his father's women. Some senior wives and mothers of princes retained status and were moved to comfortable retirement quarters. Most women were simply forgotten, maintained at minimal expense in distant palaces, their stipends reduced to subsistence levels. They lived out their remaining years in compounds that became geriatric prisons. Women who had entered the harem as teenagers now ancient and invisible, their youth in beauty and suffering meaning nothing in the new regime's calculations. The most tragic fate awaited concubines and slaves who had borne the previous emperor's children. If those children were male and represented potential succession threats, they were often eliminated, either executed outright or forced into confinement, where they died conveniently of illness within months. Their mothers usually died with them, officially of grief or disease, actually of political necessity. It was cleaner to remove all traces of potential rival bloodlines than to risk future challenges. Shah Jahan's succession in 1628 involved the execution of dozens of relatives and their mothers, creating mass graves that archaeologists would later discover beneath palace grounds. During Aurangzeb's reign in the late 17th century, the system reached its most oppressive form. Aurangzeb's religious conservatism intensified zanana restrictions. He banned music and dance in the harem, previously among the few sources of pleasure for confined women. He increased surveillance, requiring daily reports on every woman's activities and conversations. He reduced stipends for women he deemed insufficiently pious, his concept of piety being complete submission and silence. The zanana under Aurangzeb became less a court and more a prison. Women's health deteriorated. Bernier, still documenting court life, noted that women in Aurangzeb's harem had the appearance of prisoners in a plague house, pale, thin, moving like ghosts through corridors that smelled of sickness and despair. The system finally collapsed with the Mughal Empire itself. As British power expanded in the 18th and early 19th centuries, the imperial zananas declined from centers of power to relics of a dying dynasty. The last Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, maintained a small harem in the Red Fort of Delhi. Fewer than 100 women where once there had been thousands. When the British exiled him after the 1857 rebellion, they dispersed his zanana. Most of the women had nowhere to go. Some were taken in by relatives who had long ago given them up for dead. Some disappeared into Delhi's slums. Some simply vanished from historical record entirely, as they had been invisible all along. Modern historians debating the Mughal harem often fall into two camps. Some emphasize the power that elite harem women could achieve, pointing to figures like Nur Jahan, who ruled through her husband, or Mumtaz Mahal, whose husband built the Taj Mahal in her memory. They argue that the harem offered women opportunities unavailable in the broader patriarchal society. Others focus on the violence and confinement, seeing the harem as institutionalized sexual slavery with rare exceptions that prove the rule rather than contradict it. Both are partially correct, which makes the historical reality more disturbing. The system could offer power to exceptional women while crushing thousands of others. It could contain genuine affection between some emperors and consorts while treating most women as disposable commodities. It could be both palace and prison, opportunity and obliteration, depending entirely on circumstances beyond any woman's control. What's undeniable is the scale of suffering. Across 331 years of Mughal rule, from Babur's victory in 1526 to the British exile of Bahadur Shah Zafar in 1858, hundreds of thousands of women passed through imperial and noble zananas. Most left no historical trace beyond occasional mentions in account books, numbers in ledgers recording stipend payments or fabric purchases. They were born. They were beautiful or useful enough to be taken. They lived in confinement. They aged. They died. Their names, their thoughts, their dreams, their resistance, all erased by a system designed to consume them and move on. The genetic legacy remains. DNA studies of populations descended from Mughal territories show markers consistent with systematic incorporation of captured women into Mughal bloodlines. Millions of people alive today carry genetic echoes of women whose names they'll never know. Women who didn't choose the circumstances of their children's conception, who survived long enough to give birth, but maybe not much longer. The architectural legacy remains too. The Red Fort, Fatehpur Sikri, the Lahore Fort, all contain elaborate zanana quarters. You can walk through them today, tourists shuffling through rooms where thousands of women once lived and suffered. The spaces are empty now. The screened windows looking out on gardens, the carved marble screens filtering light into geometric patterns. Beautiful spaces that held beautiful cruelties. Silent now, except for tour guides reciting sanitized histories that mention the harem as a footnote, a curiosity, never as the site of systematic violence that it actually was. If this history disturbs you, it should. If you've made it this far, you understand that empires aren't built just with armies and administration, but with the bodies of conquered people, particularly conquered women. The Mughal system wasn't an aberration. It was a refined version of practices common to most pre-modern imperial systems. What makes it particularly well documented is the Mughal obsession with record-keeping. They wrote everything down, and those records, preserved in Persian, Urdu, and later English translations, tell stories the architects of empire never intended to tell. Stories of women who resisted by remembering their real names, who protected each other when possible, who found moments of joy in friendships that violated harem rules designed to keep them isolated, who survived decades of confinement with their minds intact, even if their spirits were permanently scarred. Stories of women who didn't survive, who broke under the psychological pressure, who chose death over continued existence in the gilded cage. The women of the Mughal Zananas have no monuments. No one built them a Taj Mahal. Their graves are unmarked if they have graves at all. But their stories persist in fragments, in court chronicles that mention them in passing, in European travelers' accounts that documented what they saw with horror or fascination, in the architectural spaces that still bear witness to their confinement. We owe them memory. We owe them the acknowledgement that what happened to them was systematic violence dressed in silks and perfume, that beauty doesn't erase brutality, that privilege for a few doesn't justify suffering for many. Understanding their stories means confronting how power actually works, how it creates hierarchies of suffering, how it convinces some victims to oppress others in exchange for survival. The Mughal Zanana was gone, but the logic that created it persists anywhere women's bodies are treated as assets to be controlled rather than as humans deserving autonomy. That's why these stories matter, not as historical curiosities, but as warnings, as evidence of what systems of power will do when unchecked, as testimony that must be heard. If you found this history valuable, consider subscribing to this channel. The archives are full of stories that empires tried to bury beneath layers of bureaucratic language and official silence. Stories that women survived and passed down, despite the systems deliberately designed to erase them. Stories that matter. And in the comments, tell me which other hidden royal histories do you want exposed? Which women whose suffering has been deliberately buried by official narratives do you want to hear about? Where are you listening from? I want to know that this truth is reaching across oceans and borders, that people everywhere are learning what their empires tried to hide. That's what makes this story matter. Not that it happened centuries ago, but that knowing it happened changes how we understand power, trauma, and the systematic destruction of autonomous will. It changes how we recognize these patterns when we see them operating today. The story of the Mughal Zanana is a reminder that history isn't finished with us. It echoes forward through time. It teaches us what systems are capable of when they put their full force toward the destruction of human beings. And it reminds us that the most effective violence is often the kind that leaves no marks, the kind that happens inside someone's mind, the kind that an empire can carefully hide for centuries until patient researchers finally pull back the curtain. Until next time, remember this: the official story is rarely the true story. The history they teach in schools has been edited for comfort, simplified for easy consumption, stripped of the complexity and horror that makes it real. What we're doing here is reading the unedited version, the version that empires didn't want written. And that's where the real understanding begins. Not in the comfortable narratives, but in the difficult truths that challenge everything we thought we knew about power, tradition, and human resilience.